We have watched a lot of incredible Survivor Series matches. There were a lot of legendary wrestlers and characters here who have debuted, championships have been contested, and grudge matches have been settled. And today, with a lot of excitement, we take a look at the top 10 Survivor Series moments of all time. Number 10, 1998. The Rock turns heel. Just 2 years earlier at Survivor Series 1996, Rocky Maivia had become an overnight sensation after his big debut. However, as I said previously, nobody could have guessed what the next 2 years would do to his career. With his new persona, The Rock had become one of the biggest stars in wrestling, and he was one of the heavy favorites going into the 14-man tournament for the vacant WWE Championship at Survivor Series in 1998. The People's Champ defeated the Big Boss Man in the first round, Ken Shamrock in the quarterfinals, and found himself in the Final Four. He would watch as, in the first semifinal, Shane McMahon would align himself with his father and turn on Stone Cold Steve Austin in his match against Mankind, in what in itself was an awesome moment. The Rock would defeat The Undertaker by disqualification in the following match after some outside interference from the Big Boss Man and Kane, leading to a tournament final with Rock as the fan favorite and Mick Foley's Mankind as the heel. In what could only be described as one of the best double turns in WWE history, the McMahon family would screw over Foley and align themselves with The Rock in what was basically a recreation of the previous year's Montreal Screwjob. As Foley was in the sharpshooter, Vince called for the bell even though Foley had never tapped out, and the new corporate champion was crowned in the form of The Rock. This event would lead to some great matches between The Rock and Foley, including their brutal I Quit encounter at the Royal Rumble, and would ultimately lead to the first of 3 WrestleMania showdowns with Austin. Really great stuff all around that night. Number 9. 2002 HBK wins first Eliminator Chamber. 2.5 months prior to the 2002 edition of Survivor Series, Triple H had been awarded the World Heavyweight Championship as the big gold belt made its way back to WWE. And speaking of making it back to WWE, there was Shawn Michaels, who had been out of the ring for nearly 5 years due to a back injury. This led to an epic encounter between the two at SummerSlam in an unsanctioned match that HBK would win. But with Triple H being awarded the title anyway not long after, Michaels had bigger things in mind come Survivor Series. But he just didn't have to deal with Triple H. He also had to battle Chris Jericho, Kane, Booker T, Rob Van Dam, and he would have to do so in the very first Elimination Chamber match in WWE history. The new structure had been introduced by Raw General Manager Eric Bischoff to counter the Blue Brand's Hell in a Cell match from No Mercy, and was to be a mix of the Survivor Series elimination format, the Countdown style of Royal Rumble, and the enclosed style of WCW's War Games. Seriously, could War Games just come back already? Add in the pods and the chain and the metal on the outside of the ring, and you had a brutal match on your hands, and that's exactly what it turned out to be. After half an hour and 4 eliminations, the founders of DX squared off 1-on-1 to decide the World Heavyweight Championship, and they did not disappoint. To give the other 4 members credit, nobody disappointed on that night, and in the end, Shawn Michaels completed one of the most unlikely comebacks to the top as he hit sweet chin music on his former best friend to pick up the pin in one of the greatest matches and moments in Survivor Series history. Number 8. Stone Cold gets run over. 6 years earlier at Survivor Series 1999, another big event took place at Joe Louis Arena in Detroit when an incident involving Stone Cold Steve Austin led to one of the biggest Who Did It moments in WWE history. The main event that night was supposed to be a triple threat match between 3 of the biggest names in the industry in Austin, The Rock, and Triple H. However, Austin would never make it to the match. In reality, Austin was taking time off from WWE to heal yet another neck injury, and the company had to find a way to write him off of television. So they devised a storyline to have Austin chase Triple H into the backstage parking lot area after being interrupted in an interview and was subsequently run down by a car in a truly shocking moment. Fingers were immediately pointed to Triple H for the incident, who along with his DX stablemates denied any involvement in the situation. Austin was loaded into an ambulance and replaced in the main big event by Big Show, who had already competed and won a traditional Survivor Series match earlier in the night. Big Show would go on to win the triple threat match in the WWE Championship, but the question of who hit Austin with the car would be the biggest story to come out of that particular Survivor Series. It wasn't until a year later that we actually found out who it was, and while the result wasn't quite worth the wait, the incident actually led to the feud between Vince and Triple H that brought the Triple H and Stephanie era to us, so it really was worth it. Number 7, The Undertaker stuns Hulk Hogan to win the WWE Championship, Survivor Series 1991. Younger fans may not remember this, but back in the 80s and early 90s, the Hulkster didn't really lose that often. He was facing a stiff test at Survivor Series 1991 in the form of a young rising dead man, The Undertaker. But most fans expected the Phenom to be the latest person to be stacked on the pile of people that ate the big boot and the leg drop, brother. Let's not forget that the Hulkster was in the middle of a dominant title reign, and this was still just a year off from The Undertaker's debut at the previous year's Survivor Series. Near the end of the match, Taker hit the tombstone, but Hogan hulked up immediately. It seemed like the match was just going to be business as usual. The Taker persevered and Ric Flair, woo, eventually came out, placing a steel chair on the mat so the Taker could hit Hogan, and with yet another tombstone on it. That was enough to put the Hulkster away and bring Taker his first WWE Championship. Number 6, Paul Heyman turns on Brock Lesnar, Survivor Series 2002. Since his debut in 2002, Brock Lesnar brutalized any opponent that got in front of him, going on to win the WWE Championship in his debut year from The Rock. Survivor Series heading into the event that year, the next big thing got into a feud with the Big Show and had his advocate Paul Heyman worried. Heyman tried to get Brock to call off the match, but the champ wasn't having it. He wasn't backing down. In a truly shocking turn of events, while Lesnar had Show beaten following an F5, Paul Heyman ended up turning on Brock Lesnar. He knocked out the referee, allowing Big Show to win with a choke slam, distracting Lesnar and having him planted on a steel chair, picking up the win and winning the WWE Championship. Number 5, 1991, The Undertaker defeats Hulk Hogan. Back in the 1980s and early 1990s, it wasn't that often that Hulk Hogan got pinned, or lost in any fashion for that matter, but that's exactly what happened at the 1991 edition of the Survivor Series. Just 1 year after his debut in WWE, The Undertaker found himself in a WWE Championship match with arguably the biggest star the industry has ever seen in Hogan. And to make things a little more interesting, another man who could make that claim, Ric Flair, got involved in things as well. Now, the match itself certainly isn't a classic, but it does serve as a classic moment. At the end of the match, Flair inserted himself into things by sliding a chair into the ring as The Undertaker delivered a tombstone to Hogan, thus knocking Hogan out and allowing the dead man to pick up the pinfall victory, securing the first championship in his storied career. Never mind that he lost it only a few days later back to Hogan at Tuesday in Texas, and the title was vacated shortly after due to the controversial finishes of the matches. Number 4, 2001 WWF vs. The Alliance. When Vince McMahon purchased WCW in the spring of 2001, abruptly ending the Monday Night War, wrestling fans around the world hoped that at some point they would see a WWF vs. WCW matchup. And while the A-list roster took their sweet time getting there, we still got an invasion storyline that also involved ECW, as well as some crazy twists and turns that came to the head at Survivor Series in 2001 as the World Wrestling Federation took on the Alliance. While the Alliance team could have been made of guys like Hulk Hogan, Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, Goldberg, and Sting, instead we got Shane McMahon, who had kayfabe brought WCW out from underneath his father, Steve Austin, who had gone to WCW, Kurt Angle, who sided with ECW, Rob Van Dam, and Booker T. They would take on Team WWF, which consisted of The Rock, Chris Jericho, Kane, The Undertaker, and Big Show. While this doesn't sound like a real WWF versus WCW, the angle was still quite entertaining at points, and seeing some of these guys battle on one on another at this time was still pretty solid. The match itself was very good, and to the surprise of nobody, Team WWF would emerge victorious after a 45-minute affair that saw Kurt Angle challenge his allegiance and help The Rock beat Austin to seal the victory and the end of the Invasion storyline. Number 3, 1996, The Rock debuts. Before Dwayne Johnson became the sexiest man alive, he was simply a third-generation wrestler known as Rocky Maivia. Mixing the names of his father and his grandfather, he burst onto the scene at Survivor Series in 1996 at Madison Square Garden in New York City as a teammate of Mark Marrow, Jake the Snake Roberts, and the Stalker to take on Crush, Jerry the King Lawler, Goldust, and another youngster named Hunter Hearst Helmsley on a 4-on-4 traditional Survivor Series match. Looking a little bit different than he does today, the man would become The Rock, would put on a show in his big debut. After all, his teammates were eliminated. Maivia was left in a 2-on-1 situation with Goldust and Crush, both of whom were fairly big names at the time on the mid-card level. That didn't matter as Rocky first pinned Goldust following a flying body press and then took out Crush with a shoulder breaker to get a 1-2-3 and secured the win for his team as the sole survivor. While Maivia looked to be a star, I don't think that anyone could have predicted what the future held in store for this youngster, who would obviously go on to create his new persona as The Rock after the fans got fed up with him not long after this big debut. It was only 2 years later at Survivor Series that he would once again shock the world, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Number 2, the Montreal Screwjob. Professional wrestling, or sports entertainment if that's what you want to go with, has been controversial in the eyes of many for decades in one way or another, and it doesn't get any more controversial than Survivor Series 1997. Professional wrestling has provided some of its greatest moments when things get real, and things don't get any more real than they did at Survivor Series 1997. Of course, we're talking about the Montreal Screwjob. Now, I know a lot of you may not have thought that this would be top of a best of all list, but come on, this has everything. First of all, we got another match between Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart, who absolutely disdained one another, who were always professionals and put on absolute classics with one another. I'm not saying this would have been their best match ever, but no doubt it was still pretty good. Then throw in the real-life element of Bret Hart not wanting to do the professional thing in this case and drop the belt on his way out of the company as $9 million and a disastrous finish to his career awaited him in WCW. Throw in a referee and a championship challenger that lied for years about not knowing what was going to happen as this went down, and add the owner of the company to this mix, and we got the best moment in Survivor Series history. Again, you may not look at this as the best moment, but the look on Bret's face when he realized what had happened was priceless. Add to that him spitting in Vince McMahon's face, tearing up the set afterwards, and air writing WCW in the middle of a WWF ring, and this train wreck was nowhere to be but in this top spot. Yes, it was unfortunate how things went down, but I'm on the side of Vince on this one. Hart should have done what he was told and dropped the title. Period. He gets paid to do his job, and his job was to do what was right for the company, and he simply wouldn't do business. So he had business done for him, and while a lot of people would suffer in the process, including Vince himself, and the left side of his face after Hart walloped him, it was ultimately the right thing to do. And the Mr. McMahon character was born in that moment as well, which led to the feud between he and Austin that pretty much saved the World Wrestling Federation. Number 1, 2005 Team Raw vs. Team SmackDown. Now, it's hard to call an entire match a top moment, but everything leading up to this is all part of one big moment for me. Raw would invade SmackDown and vice versa each and every week leading up to this event, and every single superstar that was involved in what had become an intense rivalry. They actually spent time building this, delivered when he had to. Team Raw consisted of Shawn Michaels, Kane, Big Show, Carlito, and Chris Masters, and Team SmackDown boasted Randy Orton, Bobby Lashley, JBL, Rey Mysterio, and Batista. And again, every single guy delivered in this match. The end saw HBK in a 3-on-1 situation, but after taking out Mysterio with an amazing mid-air addition of sweet chin music, and then JBL, Michaels was left to go 1-on-1 with a young Randy Orton, who actually picked up the victory for his team following a beautiful RKO. However, his celebration didn't last long, as a returning Undertaker ruined his night and gave us even more to talk about. Throw in the great build-up, the match itself, and the return of the Dead Man, and this version of Raw vs. SmackDown makes the top 10.